Now let's work on the MOLAP cube and make changes to our reseller sales partition by eliminating this table binding to a single fact table, and we'll change this to several partitions that we define by query binding. In order to do this, we need to eliminate the partition that is using the table binding. So we'll just select delete here, and now we'll use this new partition link to create a new partition. There's a partition wizard that walks us through this process. Now, your alternative to using a partition wizard would be to use XMLA script. So we'll take a look at that as well. So we'll walk through the partition wizard. We identify the measure group that we want to use and the source of the partition. So this would be an opportunity to use different sources, different data source views, but we can identify another structure as long as it has the same physical structure that we have already defined for our initial fact table. So we need to identify the table. Even if we're going to use query binding, the wizard requires us to select a table here. And then for the query binding, we check this box, specify a query to restrict rows, and it shows us all of the columns that would be part of that table. We see the table name here, which we can change to a view if we like, and then we would add in a where clause. And then there's a warning down at the bottom to remind us that we cannot have any overlap of rows from one partition to another. Analysis services will not warn us. It's not going to do any type of validation to ensure that a row belongs to one and only one partition. That's up to us as the cube developer to ensure that our query here does not result in overlapping rows. So a common type of query binding is to use dates. We're not limited to using dates, but that's a common method. So we can say here that we want to create a partition that contains all of our items that have an order date key of 2005 dates only. So I would say less than or equal to 2005 12/31 because that's the structure month day or year month day for our order date key. I have a check syntax button here to make sure that the syntax is valid, but of course it's up to me to make sure that the logic is valid. So when we click next here, I also have an option when I create my partition whether I want the processing to occur on the local server or if I want to identify a remote analysis server to distribute the workload of my servers so that the current server is responding to queries and I have a separate server that is doing the processing, although that may have some performance implications. We can also determine where we're going to store the partition in our MOLAP mode, whether it's in the default location or some other location on our server. We click Next. We also have the opportunity to work with our aggregations at this point. We can also give this partition a name. I'll call this Reseller Sales 2005. And I'm going to skip the design aggregations. It is certainly possible to set up different types of designs for each partition. Each design can have its own storage mode. Each design can have its own aggregation design. Each partition, of course, will contain different data. We can place partitions in different locations, as we saw in the wizard. And there's one other setting that's not available in the wizard, but it is one that we ought to set, and that is the slice. Now, Analysis Services is supposed to detect the slice automatically, but it's better if we add in the slice directly. And in this case, this would be a date slice based on the calendar year 2005. And that's all we need to do is to specify the member or the set of members that would be associated with this partition. So we can repeat this process. We could add a partition that has 2 years worth of data. So again, we would start the process with the selection of a table. We indicate that we want to use query binding here, and then we could use a query that restricts our dates. So here I'm going to use 2 years worth of data. So our partition size does not need to be consistent from one partition to another, whether it's number of rows or the number of members of a given dimension that's included there. And again, we set the slice. In this case, it's going to be a set of members. And the third partition we can set up in Management Studio. Before we do that, let's go ahead and deploy the changes that we've made thus far so that when we go to Management Studio, the current design will be processed up there. And if we browse our cube, let's bring in reseller sales by date, and we can see that we currently only have 2005 to 2007 data, even though we should have 2008 data here as well. We have not included that date range in any of the partitions that we've created thus far. So when we go into Management Studio, we can expand to see our partitions, which currently we have the 2. If we want to create a new partition, there's a new partition command here that opens the wizard. Alternatively, we can right-click on an existing partition and select the option to script the partition. And so here we have an XMLA command. We can see the database ID, the cube ID, which doesn't match what we saw here, but if we were to actually look at the properties of this particular cube, we would see the cube ID here is indeed sales. And we can see the measure group ID, which again would not be the measure group that you see in the list of measure groups, but we'd need to look at the properties and see the underlying ID itself. So here we have the partition name and ID. So if I want to create a 2008 partition, I would need to make sure that I have unique IDs here. We can see that the type is query binding. We have the data source ID as well as the query definition, and this is where I would need to change my where clause. So if we were to automate this process of creating partitions, for example, we could use an execute DDL task in integration services, we would have a where clause that instead of hard coding the where clause as we see here in this XMLA script, we would have a variable as a placeholder and then pass the value of the variable into the package at runtime, or derive it through expressions in some way, provide that where clause definition, and then automate the process of partition creation. So I'm just going to manually update this. So we have a less than that I'm going to change into a greater than or equal to, and we'll have 2008-0101 here. We can change the storage mode. We can change the slice, which will be 2008. And there is our partition. I'm going to execute this. If we refresh our partitions, we see that that partition now exists. However, I have not processed that partition. If we go to browse the cube, We don't see any change yet because all I've done is created the partition, but it's currently an unprocessed partition. So what we can do is process that partition individually through a process command. And this needs to be a process full because it's currently a brand new partition that's never been processed. And I can process this without impacting the existing partitions. And now that that's processed, we reconnect, and we can see now that the 2008 partition has been added to the cube, and now we get the correct reseller sales amount value.